Libya, 1941. A British tank commander peers through binoculars at a ridge 2,000 yards distant. Empty ground. No movement. No dust clouds. His intelligence reports say the Germans are elsewhere, regrouping near Benghazi. He orders his column forward. 5 minutes later, shells begin falling with surgical precision. Not from where he expects. His lead tanks erupt in flames before they can return fire. The 2-pounder guns on his Matildas are useless at this range. He cannot even see the enemy position. His crews bail out, running desperately across open desert as more rounds find their targets. In 90 seconds, 13 of his 18 tanks are burning hulks. The guns that killed them are 80mm Flak pieces, originally designed to shoot down aircraft. Rommel's Afrika Korps has turned anti-aircraft weapons into the deadliest tank killers in North Africa. And the British commander never saw them coming. This was the Afrika Korps. Not the largest German force of World War II, not the best equipped, but the most feared opponent the British faced in the desert, commanded by a man who would earn the nickname Desert Fox by doing the impossible with forces that should never have succeeded. Every nation fighting in North Africa faced the same brutal logistics. The desert killed as efficiently as any weapon. Distances measured in hundreds of miles. No railways. Single coastal road. Supply convoys that burned fuel just to deliver fuel. Heat that could cook a man inside a steel tank. Sandstorms that grounded aircraft and buried vehicles. A landscape so flat that movement could be spotted from 50 miles away on clear days, making every advance visible to enemy reconnaissance. The British had shorter supply lines, naval superiority, more tanks, more men, and air bases within striking range. The Afrika Korps arrived in February 1941 with explicit orders: hold Tripoli, prevent further Italian collapse, do not advance. Hitler sent them as a blocking force, nothing more. The German High Command calculated what could be sustained across the Mediterranean with Royal Navy submarines prowling the routes. 2 divisions, the 5th Light Division, later redesignated 21st Panzer, and the 15th Panzer Division. Perhaps 9,300 German troops initially, supported by Italian units. On paper, they stood no chance. German Quartermaster Major Otto recognized immediately what would haunt the entire campaign. The Afrika Korps would operate at distances from their base, half again, as large as normally considered sustainable by motor transport. Tripoli to the Egyptian frontier, over 1,000 miles, every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every replacement part had to survive the Mediterranean crossing. Unload at Tripoli's limited port facilities, then travel those distances over a single exposed coastal road. Malta, that tiny British-held island in the middle of the Mediterranean, could interdict convoys. Royal Navy submarines hunted supply ships. The RAF bombed port facilities relentlessly. In September 1941, 30% of Axis supplies never reached Africa. In November, 50%. The Afrika Korps needed 70,000 tons of supplies monthly. Tripoli could barely handle half that capacity. Rommel looked at these numbers and ignored them. On February 12, 1941, Erwin Rommel stepped off a Heinkel He-111 bomber in Tripoli. At 49, he already had a reputation. Pour le Mérite winner from the First World War for mountain exploits at Caporetto. Commander of 7th Panzer Division in France, where he had behaved more like an 18th century hussar on a raiding mission than a divisional commander. He led from the front, turned off his radio to avoid orders restraining him, and drove his Ghost Division 200 miles in a single day during the invasion of France. The German High Command sent him with clear instructions: defensive operations only. The British Western Desert Force had just humiliated the Italians, capturing 130,000 prisoners and 400 tanks while losing fewer than 2,000 men. Stabilize the line. Wait for reinforcements. Do not risk the limited forces Germany could spare from preparations for Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Rommel boarded a reconnaissance aircraft the day after arriving. He personally flew over the battlefield. What he saw changed everything. The British had overextended themselves. Their best units were being withdrawn for Greece. The remaining forces were scattered, disorganized, vulnerable. On March 24th, against explicit orders from Berlin and Rome, Rommel attacked. His tactics were unlike anything the British had experienced. In 12 days, with forces that never exceeded regimental strength in any single engagement, Rommel reconquered all of Cyrenaica. He used what would become his signature move at Agudabia: pin the enemy in front with infantry while dispatching panzers on a wide sweep through the open desert flank to the south. The British defensive position unhinged completely. By April, the Afrika Korps stood at the Egyptian frontier, with Tobruk under siege. German commanders in Berlin were shocked. Italian commanders were furious. General Garibaldi, the nominal Axis commander, reminded Rommel that supply lines were already at breaking point. Hitler sent radio messages warning him not to do anything rash. Rommel kept advancing anyway. When asked by Chief of the General Staff Halder how he planned to supply a drive to Egypt and the Suez, Rommel gave his classic reply: "That's quite immaterial to me." But the weapon that truly terrified the British was not Rommel's audacity. It was the 88. The 8.8 cm Flak Anton 36-37 was designed by Krupp as an anti-aircraft gun. In that role, it was formidable, capable of engaging bombers at altitudes up to 8,000 meters, with a firing rate of 15 to 20 rounds per minute. But in May 1940 at Arras, Rommel discovered something else. When British Matildas II tanks counterattacked with 78 mm frontal armor, German 37 mm Pak anti-tank guns were useless. The shells simply bounced off. German tank crews panicked. Rommel personally organized nearby 82 mm Flak batteries into a gun line and opened fire at the British tanks. The results were devastating. The 88 fired a 21-pound projectile at 2,140 feet per second with muzzle velocity that could penetrate the frontal armor of any Allied tank in North Africa at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. It could kill a British tank at distances where British guns could not return effective fire. The 2-pounder gun standard on British tanks in 1941 was effective to perhaps 1,000 yards. The 88 could engage and destroy them at twice that range. Rommel brought this lesson to Africa with lethal effect. At Halfaya Pass in June 1941 during Operation Battleaxe, Rommel prepared what the British would call Hellfire Pass. He buried 5 88mm guns in the ground at the top of the pass, creating a tank trap invisible to British reconnaissance. When 18 Matilda tanks advanced on June 15th, the 88s opened fire with surgical precision. 15 of the 18 were destroyed on the first day. British tank crews watched their vehicles torn apart by weapons they could not see, could not locate, could not engage. Cyril Joly, a British tank commander, described the impact in his book, Take These Men. The shell penetrated the front just in front of the loader. It twisted the machine gun out of its mounting, then hit a ready round, setting it on fire. The explosion wrecked the wireless, tore the loader's head and shoulders from his body, and started fires among the ammunition boxes. Chaos, flame, smoke. Death before they could even identify the target. American observers with the British 8th Army sent cables back describing the 88 as the most feared weapon British tanks had to face. The destruction it wrought on both chassis and turret was incomparably greater than any other Axis weapon. What made it more terrifying was how Rommel used it. Traditional doctrine positioned anti-tank guns defensively. You dug in, waited for enemy armor to close, then engaged. Rommel integrated his 88s directly into his panzer battalions for offensive operations. The guns traveled with the tanks, towed by half-tracks, ready to unlimber in minutes. When his Panzer IIIs and IVs spotted British armor, the 88s would stop, drop off their wheels, extend their legs, and begin firing before the British even knew the Germans had anti-tank capability in the area. The moment British tanks were spotted, Rommel's forces stopped and engaged. It was not a fair fight. The 88 could fire from positions the British could not reach, and remarkably, Rommel initially had only about 20 88mm guns in North Africa, with perhaps 12 operational at any time. With those 20 guns, the Afrika Korps is credited with destroying over 2,000 assorted Allied vehicles in the desert. But firepower alone does not explain the legend. Rommel's true genius lay in deception and speed. He converted Kubelwagen staff cars into dummy tanks using wood and canvas. From the air, British reconnaissance could not tell the difference. When briefing the commander of his fake tank unit, Rommel said, "I won't hold it against you if you lose a few to British bombing," knowing the attacks would convince the enemy the decoys were real. He used dust. In the flat, featureless desert, movement created enormous dust clouds visible for miles. Rommel had trucks drag chains and metal sheets behind them to generate dust, creating the illusion of entire armored divisions where only a few vehicles existed. British commanders saw the dust, estimated force strength, and made decisions based on phantom armies. He moved at night. British intelligence would spot German positions at sunset, plot them on maps, plan responses. By dawn, the Afrika Korps would be 50 miles away in an entirely different position, hitting British supply dumps the enemy thought were safely behind the lines. He flew reconnaissance himself. Rather than wait for intelligence reports filtered through staff officers, Rommel piloted his Fieseler Storch observation aircraft personally over the battlefield. He saw British dispositions firsthand, made decisions in real time, and adjusted his attacks before the British could react. His officers joked that serving with Rommel required an iron body and nerves of steel. He did not spare the people around him any more than he spared himself. The British studied this approach desperately. Commanders Wavell and Auchinleck received orders from London. Stop sitting in Cairo. Get to the front. Lead like Rommel does. But copying tactics is easier than copying the man. Between March 1941 and June 1942, Rommel's undersupplied, outnumbered Afrika Korps drove the British back and forth across Libya and Egypt in a campaign that resembled maritime warfare more than land battle. Tanks roamed the open desert like ships at sea, sailing where they wished, looping around enemy flanks hundreds of miles into the deep desert, emerging unexpectedly to deal devastating blows. His greatest triumph came at Gazala in May 1942. The British had prepared defensive positions fortified with minefields, expecting a frontal assault. Rommel sent his armor on a massive southern hook, bypassing the fortifications entirely, then drove north to cut British supply lines. The Gazala line collapsed. On June 21, 1942, Tobruk fell after a brief siege, delivering 35,000 prisoners, hundreds of artillery pieces, and critically, 1,400 tons of fuel the British could not destroy in time. Hitler promoted Rommel to field marshal. At 50, he was the youngest in the Wehrmacht. 4 days later, having covered 300 miles in less than 2 weeks, the Afrika Korps crossed into Egypt. Cairo prepared to evacuate. Royal Navy ships left Alexandria, sailing to Djibouti. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked as though Rommel might actually reach the Suez Canal with only 44 operational tanks. He stopped at El Alamein, 60 miles from Alexandria. Not because the British stopped him, because he ran out of fuel. This was always the Afrika Korps' Achilles heel. Not British tanks, not superior numbers. Logistics, mathematics. The brutal calculus of supply lines stretching over 1,400 miles from Tripoli to El Alamein. every mile forward increased fuel consumption. Every gallon of fuel delivered consumed another gallon in transport. Rommel's brilliant tactics could not overcome the fact that 80% of his transport vehicles at one point were captured British trucks. His chief of staff estimated that reality in exasperation. When Hitler refused to invade Malta in favor of the Eastern Front, he sealed the Afrika Korps' fate. Royal Navy submarines and RAF bombers from Malta savaged Italian convoys throughout 1942. The supplies that did arrive often sat in Tripoli for weeks because the Afrika Korps lacked sufficient trucks to move them forward. Rommel's forces captured supply dumps during advances, then consumed them. When British forces counterattacked, those same dumps could not be recovered. The end began at Alam Halfa in September 1942. Bernard Montgomery, the new 8th Army commander, fought a defensive battle. He let Rommel attack, channeled German armor into prepared killing zones, and refused to chase when Rommel withdrew. For the first time, a British commander refused to play Rommel's game of mobile warfare. Montgomery understood what Rommel's staff knew. Given time and no opportunities for brilliant maneuvers, logistics would defeat the Afrika Korps more certainly than any battle. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery attacked at El Alamein with overwhelming force. The British employed their own deception, Operation Bertram, using dummy tanks and fake supply dumps to convince Rommel the attack would come from the south. When captured later, German Panzer Army General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma admitted the Germans had believed the British had at least one more armored division than they actually possessed, and that the main attack would be in the south, not the north. The Afrika Korps had 90 tanks. The 8th Army had over 800. The British fired over 1,000 artillery pieces in the opening barrage. For 12 days, the Germans fought with characteristic skill and determination. But by November 4th, it was over. Rommel withdrew against Hitler's orders to stand and die in place. The retreat across North Africa lasted 6 months. Rommel fought brilliant defensive actions, pulling back, counterattacking, conserving his shrinking forces. In February 1943 at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, he gave the Americans their first taste of German tactical excellence, breaking through the Kasserine Pass and shocking inexperienced American units. But it was a final flourish, not a turning point. Allied landings in Operation Torch brought American forces into Morocco and Algeria in November 1942. The Afrika Korps was trapped. Rommel flew back to Germany in March 1943, ill and exhausted. On May 13, 1943, the last elements of the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. 275,000 Axis soldiers became prisoners of war. The legend persisted longer than the reality. The Afrika Korps never had more than 2 or 3 German divisions in theater at a time. Compare that to the 154 divisions Germany committed to Operation Barbarossa. Hitler always viewed North Africa as a sideshow, a necessary diversion to support Italy, but never a priority. The forces Rommel received could have been tripled, and still would not match what Germany sent to the Eastern Front. Yet those 2 divisions terrorized British forces for 27 months. They recaptured Cyrenaica twice. They drove to within 60 miles of Alexandria. They forced the British to maintain significant forces in Egypt that could have been deployed elsewhere. They tied down Royal Navy assets, hunting supply convoys. They created a legend that persists today. German tank losses in North Africa were 1/8 of British losses during Operation Battle Axe. That statistic is not primarily about armor quality. It is about tactics, training, and the aggressive use of combined arms that British forces struggled to counter until Montgomery's arrival. What made the Afrika Korps terrifying was not technological superiority, though the 88 helped. It was not numerical advantage, which they never had. It was the willingness to attack when outnumbered, to move when exhausted, to improvise when undersupplied, led by a commander who treated defensive orders as suggestions and logistics as someone else's problem. Rommel's approach had fatal flaws. His disregard for supply realities meant the Afrika Korps repeatedly advanced beyond sustainable limits, then had to withdraw when fuel ran out. His tendency to lead from the front meant he sometimes lost sight of the larger operational picture. His refusal to consolidate gains meant opportunities were lost. A more cautious commander might have preserved forces better, but a more cautious commander would never have achieved what Rommel did with what he had. The British built better logistics. They controlled the sea. They had secure supply routes from Alexandria. Their commanders learned from failures, adapted tactics, and eventually overwhelmed German forces through superior material and organization. The Afrika Korps died not from defeat in battle, but from starvation of supply. Still, British tank crews learned to fear the sound of an 88. Infantry learned that open ground was a killing zone. Commanders learned that German forces could appear from unexpected directions, strike decisively, and vanish before counterattacks could form. The psychological impact outlasted the tactical advantage. The Germans built the fastest-firing machine guns. The Americans built the most tanks. The British mastered logistics and endurance, but Rommel's Afrika Korps built a reputation that transcended their actual capabilities. They made a sideshow theater into a legend. They turned a defensive mission into an offensive campaign. They convinced their enemies and themselves that 2 divisions could change the outcome of a war. Other armies could fight in the desert. The British did, successfully, once they learned. The Americans did, eventually. The Italians tried and failed. But only the Afrika Korps made the desert their weapon. Only Rommel turned limited resources into maximum psychological effect. Only this undersupplied, outnumbered, impossibly overextended force made the British Empire genuinely fear they might lose Egypt. That was the Afrika Korps. Not the largest force, not the best supplied, but the one that made 2 divisions feel like 10, made every advance unpredictable, and turned the 80mm anti-aircraft gun into the most feared weapon in the desert. The British eventually defeated them, but for 27 months, Rommel's Desert Fox and his Afrika Korps were the nightmare scenario British commanders faced every morning when they looked at maps of North Africa.